all this will all be going on YouTube in the maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. All depends on how my honey-do list goes this weekend. This is not a full-time thing for me. I still have a job and a wife to report to. But obviously, we are all here today to talk with Kate Elliott. She has been writing for quite a while. Well, she's been writing since she was 9 years old. She's been published, if I remember correctly, since 1990. Just to put that in perspective, I had just gotten out of high school, so has been around quite a while. Was a child in rural Oregon, as I understand, and has managed to trade that up for Hawaii. Most of us would probably take that trade. I've been there a couple times. Didn't run into her. Just surprising. No, it's not surprising. So his most recent novel is actually The Keeper's Six. Am I correct? Is that the last one that came out?
Furious Heaven is the most recent one.
I could have sworn Furious Heaven came out before the...
No.
I feel I have that backwards in my head.
It doesn't. It just... because people were waiting for Furious Heaven.
Gotcha.
They didn't know about The Keeper's Six, which is a standalone, right? But they were waiting for Furious Heaven because it's book 2 of The Sun.
Maybe did the when so Keeper 6. I forgot to bring that in here with me. That I thought that came out this year.
It did. I had 2 books out this year.
Gotcha. I must have looked somewhere. I saw something and it said that Furious Hope had come out in 22, but I think it must have lied to me.
That's because so when people write trilogies, publishers really want to bring them out one a year. Because that's where you get that sense, or you'll get one book and people read it and then they don't have to wait too long before the next book comes out, because big gaps in publication don't help your readership find you.
Gotcha.
Or people might forget about the book. If you're a really, really big name, a couple of years gap between your last book and your next one won't hurt too much. But then when it gets to be bigger and bigger, and I won't mention, there's a couple of well-known people who, their last book was 5 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever. But once you get to those really long gaps, those can probably hurt their sales, and their sales are, of course, astronomically larger than mine. But when you're a mid-list writer like me, you really want to try to get that book out every year. The Sun books are just so complicated. And of course, the whole pandemic thing didn't help in terms of how it created a lot of stress for everybody, really. And writers, for some reason, you would think we would have had more time to work, but just the added stress of everything going on. So I'm pretty sure that book 2, Furious Heaven, the sequel to Unconquerable Sun, was originally listed as being published in 2021, and then it got moved to 2022. Oh, and actually it was supposed to come out in 2022, and then it got moved again.
Gotcha.
The publisher moved it. So I thought it was going to come out in August 2022.
See, and
and it was actually, I wrote it and turned in the revisions I turned in the revisions in the fall of 2021. And then for publishing reasons, it got moved.
And I grabbed the ebook, so the copyright probably didn't jump out at me. I was just looking it up online somewhere, and I'm like, well, crud, because I didn't even know about Keeper 6. I just kind of stumbled across it as actually at the Literati bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan, because I am physically incapable of going into a bookstore and not picking up something. And I saw your name there. I'm like, I didn't even know about this book, so I had to grab it. Yeah. By the way, if anybody's looking for a nice, fast read, that book, 2 days tops, and I work. It was, and that's not even that it was short. It was just such an easy read. I loved it. But we have gone off the bio. So obviously, I have gone off the bio. Unconquerable Sun, then I was mistaken, is the latest one. Anybody who's not read, Furious Hope.
Furious Heaven is book 2.
Furious Heaven.
Number 1 is Unconquerable Sun. Number 2 is Furious Heaven. I'm working on number 3 now.
I will apologize. I actually did. I printed this off the website, so I admit it, because I was trying to get.
And my website is a little out of date.
A little bit. That's why I knew that was Unconquerable Sun was the first one, because I read that one a while ago, and then I picked up Furious Heaven, as I said, as an ebook. I was reading that. Anybody who hasn't followed that series so far, basically, as I said, it's a gender swapped Alexander the Great in space. Funnily, that's not a word. Anyhow,
It is a word. It is a word.
word?
I accept it as a word.
Okay.
I accept it as a word.
I mentioned that to somebody the other day when I told them I was going to talk to you, and I explained to them, I worded it that way, gender swapped Alexander the Great or Alexander the Great in space, and they're like, okay, I've got to read that. So I love some of the descriptions. I read you first, and don't ask me any questions about it because I read it when it came out, but way back in 1990, Kings, and now the name is stopping. But anyhow, it's the Crown of Stars series.
Yeah. So the first King's Dragon came out in 1997.
Yeah, and so like I said, I read it when it came out, so it's been a while. And then I will admit I have not read it, but now I want to. Afro-Celtic post-Roman alt history fantasy with lawyer dinosaurs, cold magic. Did not know that's what that was about, but I'm gonna have to give that a try. And then also, of course, obviously you've got these ones now. You've also got the Court of Fives YA fantasy novels of Duran. And the Crossroads trilogy, which I have not read either, with giant justice eagles.
Yeah.
I do have to say the descriptions of your books, I have a feeling that people either look at these and go like, what? Or they're going to be like, okay, I got to read that. I don't feel like you have a lot of like, maybes. Your descriptions of some of your books are like, it's grabbing the attention of specific people.
You know, I had to learn how to do that because if you ask me, what's this book about? What's Court of Fives about? I would go, well, there's this girl and she has a family. And actually, it's really a story about, I wanted to like really examine how girls can be super competitive athletes, right? And you're like, whatever, right? So I'm really bad at talking about my own work because I don't know, it's so much in my head. So I had to learn how to do these pitches, right? Because it's like that Hollywood thing, which I kind of find it's kind of eye-rolling to me, but at the same time, it's useful. So I spent a while coming up with, for example, Court of Fives, the young adult fantasy trilogy. So its pitch is Little Women meets American Ninja Warrior in a fantasy world inspired by Cleopatra's Egypt.
Well, see, but that catches the people's attention.
See, exactly. Exactly. And if I just said it's about this girl and she's competing and then her family gets in trouble, like, what does that even mean? So it's useful to grab these things because actually, I mean, why do we love stories? We love stories when we connect with them. And so that's what you're doing with a pitch. You're trying to get to people say, I think there's a place you could connect with this story. Reader who has thousands of books to choose from.
Yeah.
So,
and it's getting worse. I mean, anybody almost can get published anymore. You've been published since back when it was hard.
Well, I mean, publishing has always been, I think publishing is still a rough business because obviously I can typeset the thing I wrote, right? I can format it and I can throw it up on Kindle using their easy to use program, which Amazon is making money off me. Not really, I'm not really making money off them. They're really making money off me. I can throw that up there, but how many people are really going to read that? You know, in reality, there are people like talking about the self-publishing world, which is relatively new, that because of the rise of ebooks and the technology of ebooks. But someone like Amanda Hawking, who kind of, and even 50 Shades of Grey, which kind of blew up that world. That's when people became aware of it. That world that they published in, it's gone. Now to get attention, you know, you have to pay money for ads and you have to, so there's already more barriers, even for self-publishing. Even though I could put those books up, I might get 50 readers. Right. So I think publishing has always been difficult in that sense. And it is true that back in the day, you would have to get an agent and then, you know, and you could like query 20 agents, 50 agents, and many of them might pass. And then even when you had an agent, the agents had to query. It wasn't Frank Herbert's Dune famously rejected by multiple publishers. That's the
a lot of them have been. I mean, some of the books we fall in love with or they're considered classics, they had to fight to get them published in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, for me, Dune isn't one of my influential books, but it is an influential book. And so knowing that so many publishers passed on it is almost reassuring. Yeah. You know, they didn't know. Nobody knows.
Yeah, I'm just saying you used to be able to do, I mean, there were vanity presses, but you had to have money to get started.
I didn't have money. Yeah, and I think that's a little bit of the problem with self-publishing now, is that to get widespread views, to get eyes on your self-published book now, again, it's beginning to demand money because publishers, I say that in quotes, platforms like Amazon specifically has come to figure out that they can make money off people's dreams, which I find pretty problematic. So, they're increasingly finding ways to pull money out of these people who just desperately want to publish their book. But anyway, that's a whole other topic.
No, I often wonder every time I see like an author, and don't get me wrong, I've bought a few myself, but you see one of their ebooks up, and next thing you know, it's going for like 99 cents. And I'm like, how much is the author really getting on a 99-cent sale?
Well, and there's reasons to, like, I don't self-publish. So everything I know is stuff that I've either talked to people who self-publish, and I know some people who self-publish quite successfully, or who do hybrid publishing, where they do traditional publishing and they do some self-publishing of their own things. You can make more money if you already have a readership, right?
Yes.
And if you, but how you write. So how you write and the way you publish is different in a way for self-publishing than for traditional publishing. So Furious Heaven would not work as a self-publishing. It's incredibly long. It took me 2 years to write, and I could pop it up self-publishing, and I could never remotely make my money back to make a living on the amount of time I spent writing it. And it didn't, so I got a little bit of surety with a fairly modest advance for it, but it's probably more than I would have done if I had self-published it. So self-publishing works if you're writing shorter installments of a series that get popular. So if I'm writing book 6 of my series, of my, fantasy mystery series set in a world where my orc detective has to solve mysteries using magic, right? Which would be totally great, right? I might want to discount my first volume to get people in the door. But then my second volume would be $3.99 or $4.99. But even then, the mass market paperback versus what people are paying for ebooks, I don't know. There's just such a discrepancy. It's all I can say is that publishing is in ferment right now, and who knows where we're going to be in 10 years. I just plug along and write my books. That's all I can do.
I do have to say, even the big authors, sometimes, I'm saying this as a joke, but there was a whole thing on Castle one time. Have you ever watched Castle back in the day?
No.
Oh, okay. So anyhow, but you know the gist of it. He's an author, and there's like she's talking about, oh man, it's $2,000 to get in. He like pulls it out. It's like, who carries $2,000 on them? He's like, I'm a best-selling author. Who doesn't carry $2,000 on them? But like,
it's a fantasy novel. It's a
fantasy. But I do get a kick out of sometimes. I feel like we have this idea in our head that publishers of a certain level, and you published a lot of books. You've written a lot of books that have been published. Let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
But I also think it's like, I don't care how much you guys make on some of these things. I think if you break it down like on a per hour basis, y'all making like minimum wage.
I'm not making minimum wage.
I'm top best.
I'm making minimum wage 30 years. What would have been minimum wage 30 years ago?
Yeah.
You sent me a bunch of questions.
Yes,
right?
and I'm getting to those.
Which I printed out and looked over. No, but can we move to one? Actually,
Sure.
To raise something that I'm actually interested. Well, excuse me, that sounded bad.
No,
all of your questions.
It's fine.
All of your questions are excellent, but there was one that no one had asked me before.
Okay.
And so it says you've been writing, published, as you say, since 1990, actually 1988, but close. But when did you really start to know you were a successful author?
Mm-hmm.
So this is such an interesting question. And you talking about Castle, where he says, doesn't every best-selling author carry $2,000 in their pocket, right? And I was so struck by this because I these ideas that a best-selling author carries $2,000 in their wallet are so, to me, they're such a trap for artists and creative people. And this whole, because when we say, what does it mean? When did you know you were a successful author? Well, I could argue that I'm not a successful author. You know, I don't carry $2,000 in my wallet, if that's our measure of what success is. So the trap becomes, what is success? How are we measuring success? By what measure? By how much money we make, by whether we've won a prestigious literary award, by whether we're on the best-selling list for one book or 10 books, you know, or is someone a successful author if they get a single book published? You know, which is something many people never do. Most people may never do. So we bring so many assumptions to this question of what is success. And it's something that I've had to struggle with as a writer. You know, this idea that, well, I failed because X, because I didn't get Y. I don't have a film made of my book. So you can, and so I've had to really re-examine what it means when we use that word success, because it's easy to focus on the negative things, the things you didn't get when you see someone get 100,000 copy print run. Oh, I've had books, like King's Dragon has sold more than 100,000 copies over its lifetime, the first of the Crown of Stars books. And I think the second one, Prince of Dogs, may have as well. But I've never gotten 100,000 copy initial print run before the book came out. So it's easy, I think, for writers to look at that and say, that's a successful author. I'm not a success. But in fact, what success is, I think, needs to be, or for me, we need to stop measuring it in these very restrictive ways. I've never known whether or not I was a successful author, but I'm still here and I'm still publishing.
Right.
And that's success in the sense that I haven't stopped writing. So I have successfully not stopped writing, despite some ups and downs, some definitely some really difficult things that I've had to deal with in publishing. And I'm about to sign a contract for something I can't talk about that because it's not announced yet, and the publisher will want to announce it. So I sold a new project this year after more than 30 years. You know, so I'm still able to do that. That's success for someone who's a mid-list writer, who's never had this huge success, who's never had any of these huge markers. So to me, that's another measure of success. You know, I've plugged along, I'm still here, and I still love writing. So the project that I sold, I actually wrote the entire book before I sold it, and I loved writing it. I just enjoyed writing it. So I haven't lost my love of writing. So those are three measures of success that some people would say aren't measures of success, but which I would just ask people who watch this, who are watching this now or who watch this later, that, you know, think about how you're measuring success and think about it in the widest sense of how big do you want, how do you want to measure success? Because it's important not to narrow it down, not to fence yourself in, and to think about the ways in which you have achieved things, however small they may seem compared to, I'm sorry, he'll always be Captain Mal to me, right?
No, I get that.
Compared to, yeah. Anyway, so I'm glad you asked that question.
I guess what I'm saying, in touch with what you're saying, success is going to be different to each person.
Yeah.
I do think that there are certain levels of success where it almost can't be argued against. Nobody's going to say Harper Lee, even though we're going to throw out that last book. We're just going to go with
Yeah.
Because she didn't want that published. One can't say, I mean, she wrote a classic. It's obviously a bestseller. You can't say she's not a successful author. Someone like you, if I remember, don't let me know if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure way back in the day, those, especially Crown of Stars, those were on the bestseller list, were they not?
No, not really.
They were not. Wow, they seem like classics to me. I guess they've just been around so long.
They've been around so long. They're still in print, and people are still reading them. And the audio version is finally coming out.
But even if
I thought that they would never be in audio, and they are. They have a fantastic voice actor, Shiromi Arserio, and the seventh book is coming out this fall.
Gotcha.
For people, so that's a whole new audience.
Right.
who would want to listen to them on audio. Yeah.
But even if they hadn't been bestsellers, to me, the number of series that you've had published, not self-published, not Vanity Press published, you've had series published, people know your name. I don't think anybody can say Kate Elliott is not a successful author.
Well,
now, if
you could say it if you had a specific measure, right? But and then maybe we writers, maybe I can be too hard on myself.
Well, if you don't think you're a successful writer, I think you are too hard on yourself. Because at least me, I would say the number of books that you have put out and published, and publishers are still saying, Kate Elliott wrote a book, that's going to sell. To me, that is at least a measure of success. There's a lot of people that, maybe they get that chance taken them on at first, and then nothing ever happens again. I mean, like I said, Harper Lee, she didn't want to, I don't think she wanted to publish anything else. But there's also people who've gotten that first book out and then nothing, one-hit wonders, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so to me, at least, I would say you are a successful writer, and people would have to have a very, very narrow view of what they consider success to not put you in that category. That's just my 2 cents.
And I would, in fact, say, I guess, that I do. Yes, if someone asked me, am I a successful author, I would say, yes, I am. But it took me a long time and a lot of examination to understand that it was the expectations and assumptions I was putting on myself that were hurting me in how I was looking at myself. And that's just what I want to say to writers. So many people are successful writers. Even just completing a novel is success.
Sure.
Even a single Harper Lee aside, how many people write one novel and then it becomes a classic that's been read for decades? But just doing it is incredible. And don't always be like me with too high don't create that bar so impossibly that you kind of beat yourself up.
I think I found, though, that a lot of authors are usually their own worst critics.
Yeah.
For me, it would probably be my mother, but no, I'm sorry, that's off topic.
That's another voice on your shoulder, right?
Exactly.
But actually, that reminds me of the whole thing about reviews, right? So you can get 10 reviews and 9 of them can be positive or even, super great, right? But then there's that one negative review. And I guarantee you, 5 years later, the only one I remember is that negative review. Like I might have like a phrase from it that I still remember, right? And then it's like oh my God, a negative review, I'm a terrible writer, right? Even though 9 people were like, oh, I really like this book, or this was fantastic, right? But they're like, it's a weird, I don't know what the psychological, someone has studied this and I don't know what it is or why we do this to ourselves. Why are we so hard on ourselves? I don't know.
I tell most authors that, you're not a real author until you've gotten your first 1-star review.
That's right.
Now, if all of your star reviews are 1-star review, you might want to rethink it. But in general, I think if most of your reviews are positive and you get that 1-star review, that means that you've reached that level. Yep. Nobody's ever going to write anything that everyone loves. And if you do write something that nobody can give a 1-star review to, nobody's going to give it a 5-star review either, because it's just going to be vanilla. Yeah,
I agree. That's why when I look at something like the chat AI, ChatGPT program,
I know what you're talking about.
There's a lot of reasons that those are problematic, but they are not going to replace writers, because they can only write like 2.5-star books. That's all they can write. They're not bringing. They literally, those programs can't bring anything unique. And it's the uniqueness that people bring to it that create the 1-star and the 5-star reviews. And you're absolutely right, because those two go together.
I mean, there's stuff in, let's just throw it out there. For instance, Furious Heaven, you've got the relationship between Sun and Hetty. There are some people that no matter how good that book is, the fact that Sun and Hetty are together, they're going to give you a 1-star review.
That's right. And Furious Heaven is a really long book. And there are some people who do not want to read a really long book. And so they'll be like, this was too long. No. And you know what? It was too long for them. There's nothing that they are absolutely correct for that. My only issue, I think for many writers, there's this book wasn't for me versus but it might be for other people. That's one view, and that's completely true. Then there's this book wasn't for me, so therefore it must be bad. That's not necessarily true, So, but that has to do with what readers bring to how they express their reading experience. And not everybody quite has that ability to step outside themselves for long enough to say, because you and I have both picked up books and we've started reading, we've got in 10 pages or 50 pages and said, you know what, this just isn't for me. I don't like it. And that's absolutely how it should be.
Catcher in the Rye. I tell people all the time, it's supposed to be this world great classic. I got through about 2 chapters and I quit reading the book.
Oh, solidarity. I read the whole thing because I had to for school and I hated it.
Luckily I didn't. And I was trying to read it later in life because of the fact that I had never read it in school and everybody always talked about it. But I literally felt like I was reading something written by an 8th grader who stopped school at 3rd grade.
But so here's a great bit. My eldest child loves that book because what's his name? Holden is an asshole and is a really well-described immature asshole. So it's like, this is a great book about a well-described immature asshole, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I didn't want to read it, but it worked.
Yeah. Well, people are different too. Just as a quick example, my daughter and I both absolutely love Count of Monte Cristo. However, I loved 1984. She was not as big of a fan, even though we loved one book equally, and the other one were on opposite ends of the spectrum. Although I still think you have to have been alive before 1984 to appreciate 1984.
Yeah.
But not even people, we don't all have, even people that you agree with or you're in solidarity with, we don't have all the same taste. That would be so boring.
It would be boring. I mean, I read Dune and I said, wow, I'm glad I read this book and I'm really glad I never have to read it again.
I liked Dune, but not enough to read the rest.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like, it was good to read it. I understand why people, love this book. And there are people who just, or actually my favorite one, my favorite example of this is I was in a random group of people who I didn't know. And one of the people in the random group was a man of about the same age, maybe a little older, probably a little older than me. We were talking about whether we read to the end of a book. Like if we started a book, we had to finish the book. And some people are like, if I start the book, I have to finish it. And I was like, yeah, I used to be like that until I was 16 or 17. And I started reading Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. And I got like partway, I was like about a third to halfway through the book. And I hit this chapter. And I remember being like 16 and going, wow, I don't have to read any more of this. I can just close this book and stop. And I said, and I did. And it was like really liberating. And this man looks at me and he goes, oh, that's the best book that's ever been written. Like I've read it like 12 times. And I was like, right. But it was cool. For him, it meant something. And for me, it was just like, oh my God, really?
It's funny that you mentioned that because I had started reading it for a book club and I never finished A Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is also
the one by him that I liked.
Yeah,
but I read it when I was young. So I don't know if I would like it now.
I think too, sometimes it was for a book club, so I had to read it. I might have enjoyed it more if it wasn't like, oh, I've got to get this read by Friday.
Yeah, that pressure. I find that the pressure. I get sent books to read for possible quotes, which I do very dutifully. Sometimes I'm really looking forward to the book and I requested it, ahead of time. I knew it was coming. Other times people send me something, hey, we've got this debut novel coming or whatever. And it's hard because I really want to help people, but sometimes the pressure of like, we need a quote by whatever makes it impossible for me to read it. Or sometimes I'm genuinely too busy, right? It falls like in a spot where I'm revising something to deadline and I just can't do it. But yeah, so the pressure is like, and then I might never read that arc. And then a year later, I might pick it up and like, wow, this was really good,
Yeah, I've read a few arcs that I used to work for a bookstore, a few arcs that came across my desk that it's like, man, I wished I had read this before it was due for Indie Next because, I would have said something nice about it. But I'm
Yeah.
reading it 3 years after the fact.
Yeah. But that's the great thing about books, though, isn't it? They don't expire.
No.
Yeah, some they can date.
Yes.
They can get dated. I'm reading an Agatha Christie mystery right now for kind of research purposes, and wow, it's interesting because in some ways the speed of the plot feels very modern, but boy, is there dated stuff in it. Wow, a lot of social stuff is like just incredibly dated, and not in a good way.
So this is the last book I'm gonna bring up that's not yours, but just made me think of it. It's like, did you ever read, and it's fine if you didn't, but did you ever read Ready Player One?
No.
That's fine. The weird thing for me was when I was reading that book is I felt that it was very, very much aimed at a younger generation, the whole virtual reality, all this and everything else. But it was so full of 1980s references. And I'm like, are the old people like me reading this and not following the whole VR thing and all that other stuff? Or are the young people reading this and going, I don't know what they're talking about. So it was dated on purpose. I did read a book one time, won't even say the name of the author because I did not like the book and I don't throw people under the bus who are still alive. But he mentioned the Iran-Contra affair. And I'm thinking is like, how many young people are even going to know what the Iran, because he doesn't explain it. He just mentions it. And I'm like, that's aimed at a very specific age group that has any idea what you're talking about. But we're getting off topic. I do that off sometimes. I tend to ramble. I am trying to stick more to the script.
Rambling. This is, but this is how, actually, this is kind of how I write. Like I have the basics of what I know. This is the question. I printed it out because I'm that anxiety person. And so I could look at the stuff, but like I have an idea of what I want to do with the book, but actually in the process of doing it, then this is what happens. And to me, the best conversations are not where you're going like straight through your talk list, but where you're talking, you're interacting about subjects matter.
And most of these is what I've been doing, but somebody had mentioned in the last one that, and again, I get it. I start chatting, we end up having a conversation, then somebody watching it later is like, I really wanted to hear more from the author than him. Once it becomes a conversation, it starts being more 50-50. So that's the reason I actually did print off the list and send it to you ahead of time, because I was trying to make this more about Kate Elliott this time around. Not as many people, they're not here to see Edward. As well as I think of myself, they're not here to see me. But I do appreciate, I like getting into a chat where you say something and that just takes you off on a tangent, and maybe 5 questions later you get back to the original issue. But let's ask a few questions just for people to get to know you. Okay. Like I said, I know you've been going around since you said 88, is that correct? Is that
the first Labyrinth Gate came out in December 1988, so almost 1989.
Maybe I had for some reason I had King's Crown. King's
Dragon is 1997, but that's 1997.
I don't know which one I thought was 1990. I was wrong. I admit it.
The High Road trilogy came out, all 3 volumes came out in 1990. So
maybe that's the one I was
looking. I'm not going to run through the title.
No. That may just be the one that got stuck in my head. You're doing this a long time. Like I said, the last 2 years, I know you've had, if I have that right, Keeper 6 came out this year, Fury 7 came out this year, Servant Mage came out last year or the year before that, is that right?
Last year. So
you got 3 of them in 2 years. Do you find that pace, and obviously these are not all sequels, these are different stories, each of them. Do you find that pace is good, it's invigorating, or do you find like, I would just like to take a breath once in a while?
It's important to note that there was a gap before Unconquerable Sun, and then there was a gap after Unconquerable Sun. So the speed of the books that have come out in the last 18 months or 16 months is unusual. And a lot of that is what I would call an artifact of publishing. So the book that hasn't been announced yet, that we can't talk about isn't coming out until 2025, and it's done.
Wow.
It's finished. It's complete. I don't even have to write it. Right? I have to revise it, but revising is a whole different process. So publishing has long lead times. So for example, Court of Fives, I sold a complete manuscript in so like April 2013. And the first book, and that book didn't come out until July 2015. So there can be these long publication gaps from when you sell the book. So if you're a big name and you turn in a book, someone might get moved to put a slot in, right?
Gotcha.
Someone might say, oh, we could move this debut author who didn't get a big advance, or this person whose third novel is coming out and it's a standalone and they're not like a big name. We could move them to a later time in order to slot this best-selling author in so we can get their book out a little faster. Though publishers can do that, although they don't always, they have other reasons why they want to publish something in spring or why they want to publish something in fall, depending on, or summer. Summer is your beach reading, and fall are your prestige books, and spring is your whatever, I don't know, right? So there's a lot of reasons why that happens. So sometimes books will come out close together, but really they maybe weren't written that close together. In my case, there was a gap of 3 years between the third of the Court of Fives trilogy, Buried Heart, which came out in 2017, and Unconquerable Sun, which came out in 2020, so both in the summer, right? So that was a huge gap, and that's kind of a devastating gap for a midlist writer. I did write 2 short novels or novellas for Magic the Gathering as work for hire that came out, one in 2018 and one in 2019. So they kind of filled in that space, right? So I had stuff coming out. So am I writing I don't know that I'm writing any more quickly than I was before, but the way the publishing has been falling out is doing this. And I'm not someone who wants to publish 3 books in a year. Even Keeper 6 and Furious Heaven are a little too close together for my taste. The Furious Heaven was originally scheduled for August 2022, and then it would have been 5 months, and then Keeper 6 would have come out.
And I think that's the date I saw was August 22. That's where I got confused.
Yeah. And I think that would have been better, but it didn't, for publishing reasons, it didn't work out like that. That's one of the things about being a writer, is you just have to learn to roll with it. And if you can't roll with it, then it's just not a good field to be in, because you're just going to be, with the exception of people who just have exceptional timing with the right project for multiple books in a row, most writers are going to have these ups and downs. So you learn to either absorb the blow or absorb the celebration and keep going. And sometimes an exceptional success can itself be hard to get past, right? Just as an exceptional setback can be hard to get past. So you just got to kind of, I think of myself as kind of a burst endurance person, I plug along, keep working.
I didn't think about it until you said it too, but it totally makes sense looking at it from the publisher standpoint. It's kind of like the movies. If for instance, Star Wars is coming out on, August 1st, and you've got some other movies like, well, we're not coming out on August 1st.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know this actually happened to me with Crown of Stars, which was not a bestseller, but was successful enough that at one point, the later books took me longer to write. I had 3 small children, and there was a lot of other stuff going on. So they took me a little longer to write than any of us would have wanted. In other words, it didn't come out one a year. It did all end up coming out. The 7 volumes came out in like 8 years or 9 years total, front to back, which isn't that bad now, but back then was kind of bad that when there was a 2-year gap. But anyway, I was at a convention one time, and I had just turned in, I don't know if it was volume 4, volume 5, and it was like late and whatever. And I was talking to my editor, and then there was another writer whose debut novel, which was it wasn't a debut novel that was going to get a big push. It was a modest debut novel, like my debut novel was back in the day, right? So I was seeing my editor, and my editor said, yes, we have a publication date for you. And she named me a month. So let's say, it's going to come out in October, right? And let's say this was January. It's going to come out in October. And that other writer looked at me She looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're the book I got moved for."
Oh, ouch.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, whoa, right? Because she wasn't happy. And I thought to myself, wow, I pushed her out of her slot. And then of course, being me, I thought to myself, well, that'll probably happen to me another time, only with me in her place, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just how it goes. Sometimes you're the book that pushes another book out, and sometimes you're the book that gets pushed out.
No, totally makes sense, because I'd never thought about it that way before. You just always have this, as a reader, you just have this, you don't see behind the curtain, and you're just like, somebody publishes a book and it just comes out.
There's all this.
They don't put any thought into it.
And it just, and the gaps between turning in a finished book and when it actually comes out are just, when the readers sees a book come out, they think it could have been turned in the month before, for all they know. It could have taken a month to go through production, but production takes months.
Yeah, that one I didn't think.
Yeah, production takes months, and it also depends on the publisher. I find my experience has been that the longer a book is in production, the better the fewer errors there are in the final version, right? The cleaner it is. So again, Court of Fives, it was turned in, the first draft was turned in spring of 2013. And it went through 3 rounds of extensive revision, because it was the first young adult I had ever written. And I had to relearn something, not relearn, I had to learn some new things in order to write young adult versus adult fantasy. And it went through those revision rounds, and then it went into production. And the page proofs, which are the last time you get to read through the book, and it's when it's typeset and laid out. And when you get an advanced, for those who don't know, when you get an advanced reader copy, that's the first pass page proofs usually. So it's the typeset version. It's going to get read a couple more times to make sure there's absolutely no errors. I got the page proofs a year before the publication date. I've never gotten page proofs that early. I will often get page proofs 3 months before the publication date, or if it's in a good situation, 6 months. So it was really interesting. At that time, back in 2015, like a century ago, right, the young adult really wanted arcs to go out super early to get as much spread through booksellers and librarians, school librarians as possible, to try to build up interest in a book. And I don't know how that works now. I haven't published a YA series since that 2015, 2016, 2017. And again, that's like a decade ago, even though it's not a decade ago.
Don't say that out loud.
Things have changed. But things have changed so much, even in the YA field. Like the way they were doing things then is not the way they're doing things now. It's like this constant churn, right?
Yep. And anybody who watches this, just remember, when she says she's turning in the final draft, or the first draft, that's the first draft you're turning into the publisher. How many times had you edited that beforehand? I mean, I know you guys go through a lot of stuff before the publisher even gets to see it.
Well, it depends on the book, and it depends on the writer. Some writers write very clean first drafts because they're doing a lot of work in their heads before it goes down on the paper. So I think of that as like the Mozart version, right? Mozart, as far as I know, supposedly Mozart composed very quickly and made very few changes once he had written down the score. So in other words, a lot of stuff was going on in his head. Whereas supposedly, and I may be wrong about this, I just love it as an analogy. So then the Beethoven would be all scratching out, and he writes stuff down, and then he rubs it all out and scratches it, and turns it over, and does over and over and over on the page. So again, I know some people who, what they turn in is either their first drafts are very clean, or they go over their draft so many times before they give it to the editor that it is in essence clean. I've had a few books like that, but I actually love working with editors. So I will often turn in, I do go through a book. In fact, while I'm writing, I'll often be going back and cleaning up things that came behind. Or I might write 2/3 of the book and then realize that there's a plot issue that I need to fix. And then I'll go back and I'll do a complete write through up to where I stopped and then finish. So I have different processes for different projects. But on a couple of occasions, I've turned in an incredibly clean draft that went through to publication without much revision with the editor. But I've also turned in books where the editor and I wrestled through 3 complicated revisions because I wanted that input. For me, it just depends on the book. Sometimes I just want that outside input, and a good editor is like priceless. They can see stuff. Other times I just really know what I'm doing. So it just depends.
Well, yeah. But I would probably argue that, and I use the word average just as what it means as an average. I feel like the average book by the average author is a little closer to Beethoven than it is to Mozart.
I think so. I don't know. I've said this before. When I was a newer writer, when I was newer to the field and in the early stages of my career, I loved first drafting because it was that whole discovery aspect, right? Here's the story and I'm writing these people down. And then I would get to the end and I would know that there was things wrong with it, but I didn't really know how to fix them. So to me, revision was this horrific, terrifying process that was really hard. But now I'm like the opposite. So now first drafting is so hard because in my head, I know that what I'm putting down isn't perfect. And then that bugs me. But sometimes with the first draft, you just have to write it wrong first so that you can fix it later. And now I know how to revise. So when I get a first draft down, I'm like, yes, now I understand what I'm doing. Now I can go in and fix X, Y, and Z. And it's really exciting. So now revising is exciting for me. So
sometimes you need that second pair of eyes too. It's like, I know there's something off here, but I can't tell what it is. What do you think? And you're still the author, but they're going to be the ones going like, well, you know, this is the part that threw me off. And you're like, that was it.
So, yeah. So sometimes I know what to fix. So I'm doing some revisions right now on the unnamed project. And once I had finished, I knew what I needed to fix, right? Meanwhile, I've got like the first, I don't know, maybe 5th of the 3rd Sun book written, and I just stalled out because I knew all the events, I know all the characters. It's the 3rd book. I'm not opening up anything new in the 3rd book. Now I'm like weaving everything together, and it's a huge, massively complicated project with a cast of thousands, right? So I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I wrote this long, something I almost never do, which is I wrote a long developmental outline and I sent it to my editor. My editor wrote back, oh, I think this event, which is one of the next things that's going to happen, I think that's what's stopping you, because I think this event doesn't need to be here. I think it needs to come later. And I'm like, that's it. I'm dreading that event, which means it's coming too early because it's too big emotionally. And I wrote up against that wall for like 3 or 4 months. Bam, my editor had it, right? Read the development outline and she sent me that. I'm like, that's it. I need to move this to, instead of here, I need to move it to here. And then it will finish anyway. So now I'm like, yes, that was it. And I don't know that I could have, I just kept running up against that barrier. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, timing is such a big part of a good book too.
Yeah.
I've had some books where I'm like, man, this is the cliffhanger. Wait, there's still 100 pages left. What? It's like, where are they going to go from here?
Yeah. I have a particular thing when I watch, especially TV shows or films, where the characters will resolve their differences and then there'll be a big fight scene or a car chase. And, at that point, I don't care, because I want the big fight scene or car chase to be part of the resolution, not the big fight scene action sequence, because the action sequence by itself, to me, isn't that interesting. It's how it embeds into the character story. Right. This is just my personal taste as a reader. But yeah, so when that kind of framework for a story, for a plot is done, I lose interest.
I'm not a big fan of what I call the gratuitous scene. It's like, if something fits a story, great. But if you put in a fight because you felt there needed to be a fight, or you put in a sex scene because you felt like it needed a sex scene, Okay, if it sometimes that's jarring when it has nothing to do with the story that you're reading. Where if it had been central to the plot, it would have gone smoothly through.
Well, and I'm thinking about things like actually superhero movies or Marvel movies where you always have like the fight with the big bad at the end.
Right.
But to me, the fight with the big bad, if everything else is resolved and then they have to beat the big bad, I just like, okay, whatever. Other people it works for, because that well, part of it is an issue with this current mode of using violence and action as if they are heightened things, where for me, as if you were a reader, and again, this is a taste thing partly, I love action and I love fight scenes when they're embedded in the character journeys. And when they're, like you said, when they're taken out, when like the big bad scene at the end is like almost a separate thing, then it doesn't work for me.
Right.
You know, now they've achieved everything they needed to do, but they have to beat the big bad to win. It's
exactly.
like,
that's my point. When it's like, oh, we forgot the fight scene, so we have the gratuitous fight scene at the end.
But
I don't mind a fight scene.
To the people, right? But to the people writing it, they clearly don't think of that as gratuitous. To them, it's like the big fight scene is like, for them in their minds, it's the culmination of everything. So, but to you and me, as readers and viewers, it's just like, okay, whatever.
Just don't make it an anticlimax. That's my point.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, actually, I'm going to go off the thing here because actually one of the things you mentioned, and it brought this up to me, you talked about emotional. Not going to do any spoilers, but the scene between Manea, and I apologize, I think it's Joao. I don't know how you say it.
Joa.
Okay, so you don't pronounce that last O.
It's Portuguese. It is.
Okay.
Joa.
Okay, Joa.
Yeah, it's Portuguese. I mean, it's not good Portuguese, my pronunciation. But
no, which is fine. It's better than what I'm trying to say. So, and I think you know which scene I'm talking about.
I know exactly which scene. Yeah.
That emotional of a scene, and that's all I'm going to say about it because I don't want to spoil it. People will get to when they get to it. Do you, and don't read anything into this because there's basically, is that the type of scene that you enjoy writing because you get to go into this deeply emotional well of stuff that maybe you don't get to do in the rest of the book? Because you can't have too many of those in there or they lose their power. Or is it one of those ones that is so heartrending that you actually don't like writing this, but it needs to be written? Because it's because of the Alexander history, I don't want to say I enjoyed writing that because enjoyment is wrong. But I know what you're saying.
I'm a parent, but I felt I knew that I had to do it. And there is a bit in that scene that one feels squeamish or incredibly uncomfortable writing. But at the same time, the emotion of the scene was very satisfying to write, not because I found it enjoyable, but because I found it real. I found it human. And I found it, and it expresses a lot of, it tells you a lot about people and their grappling for power. And that's what, that's a lot of what these books are about. There is a scene in Shadowgate, which is the second book of the Crossroads trilogy. There's a sequence, and it's not that long. It's like 10 pages. It's not explicit in any way, but was so horrific to write that it's about a completely naive young woman who totally unknowingly sells herself. She doesn't know what's happening into sexual slavery, and it's not explicit, but I had to write this sequence in which, and by the end, she's completely dissociated herself and become completely emotionally numb. I had to write it like in one sitting because it was so awful to write. I handed it in. When I handed in the book, my editor got back to me and said, "Oh, can you make this shorter and less explicit?" And I said, "Listen, this scene it's not long and it's not explicit. You're reacting to the emotion. You're reacting to the emotional reaction you're having to it. And that's what I need people to have."
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think, again, the Manea scene was very emotional and I would say horrific, but it was also very, very well done. Well, I would give you that. It was
She said, and I bet it's a weird thing to say, but yeah.
No, it was. I mean, for the topic that had to be written for that story, I don't think you could have done it any better. Honestly, you don't get explicit.
Yeah.
But you know exactly what happened, and you know what that would have to do to somebody to go through that.
And also the decisions the different people in that scene make and what it says about them. And that's the key to that scene. Yeah.
And that also may have been why I used the password that I made you use to log into Zoom.
Yeah, I saw that.
Because that was came up right after that scene, and I was like, that was such an emotional scene. Yeah. If y'all want to know what we're talking about, you're gonna have to read the book. All right. Anyhow.
Oh, I wanted to say one more thing. I mean, the Crown of Stars, people. I don't get it so much now, but while I was writing Crown of Stars, people would write me and say, when are you going to kill Hugh? Because Hugh is the primary villain, the primary antagonist in the whole entire Crown of Stars sequence. And of course, he's written very realistically and based off a genuine personality type and a man of immense privilege in that society. So he can do whatever he wants to people. And no one will. Anyway, I loved writing him, not because I loved writing him or his behavior, but because he was so, I think because his abusiveness to me is so real, because it's a real way people behave. And then I was able to frame it in a way that allowed readers to see it for what it is, when oftentimes in society, people like him get a pass totally and aren't seen that way. So for me, he's still in some ways, he's still my favorite antagonist.
Well, exactly. You've got to have a good antagonist. Now, you have to have a protagonist that you care about first, but then they've got to have an antagonist, or nobody wants to read about somebody's day going to the grocery store. You've got to have something in there.
Well, you could argue. I mean, the Sun books don't. Well, the Sun books do kind of have an antagonist, but they don't have an big A antagonist.
No,
I'm very careful in not making the Fiend Empire antagonists. They're not bad guys. They're the enemy, and they're different.
Well, yeah,
because that was true of the history. The Persian, and I mean, the Fiend Empire isn't a direct analog. I mean, they are a direct analog to the Persian Empire, but they're not based on Persian history, if you see what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
They're a whole different culture. But the Persian Empire wasn't bad. They were just an empire. They were the biggest, probably the first multi-ethnic empire in world history, arguably. So they were the big dogs of their day. And Macedon was the little scrappy dog of its day, right? So it's been interesting to write that so there are antagonists in the Sun book, but there's not like, I am the good righteous person fighting these evil people over there, right? Because I didn't want to do that. Partly because it's not true to the history, and also because I didn't want to do that.
Well, I think especially in book 2, though, you also did a very good job in bringing some of the Fiend. You brought their stories from their perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
I did like
that's important also for book 3.
Also, I do have a question for you. I don't know if I'm missing the little hint or not. It seems like, okay, every time that the main person is Persephone, the chapter is something to do with the wily Persephone. The wily Persephone is not a screamer. So you always know by the chapter head, okay, we're going to be looking at this from Persephone's point of view. I haven't actually seen a mix on the other ones necessarily where I know exactly whose point of view it's going to be by the chapter, except for Perse. We always know when it's Perse.
Yeah, and that's deliberate, because Persephone is the one who's writing in Persephone's narrative is in first person, and everyone else is in third person. So that adds that little space, right? So when you tell it in third person, it's like you're telling a history. It's like someone is telling that story. Persephone is speaking for herself. So she's telling the story she wants to tell.
I do love some of the titles of chapters, though.
I did. I had so much fun with that. If you can't have fun writing a big book, why?
Oh, yeah. I can also tell you had fun writing with I don't know how to word it, but basically the idea, if you use certain phrases that, we recognize, but of
Yeah.
course this is set so far out that sometimes they don't even know what they're saying. Like, not my circus, not my monkeys. Well, what's a monkey?
Yeah.
And then the way you described what again, I want somebody to get the joke when they read it, which is why I'm not saying the retort. But I appreciated that. I got the humor in it. The fact, I mean, I don't know how old I was when I finally figured out what the whole 9 yards actually meant. I used it all growing up. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I knew what it meant. I didn't know what it alluded to. And we do that all the time, to be honest. Oh, I love, there was one I saw a little, something about grasshopper too. And then they go up on this whole thing. Well, that doesn't make sense. You're going to learn grasshopper or something like that, the whole kung fu thing.
Yeah.
And then they go off on like, you're really calling them a grasshopper, and they're like not following the line of logic. I love those little bits of humor mixed in. That was just me. I appreciated that.
Well, and it's also, so I did do it, especially like the Proverbs where I substitute dinosaurs for mammals or birds or whatever. I really enjoyed doing those, but there's also a reason that I do it. It's not just to be fun, but it's also world building, because I want readers to be asking, why do we say an Allosaurus in the china shop and not a bull in the china shop? What's up with that? Why do we see knights? Why do they show ancient depictions of knights riding velociraptors or dinosaurs, right? And not knights riding horses. So there's a whole world building element, and it's all in the background. And I'll probably never fully, well, maybe in book 3 more will come up, right? And it's just like the naming conventions. There's just a lot of stuff that's embedded there that I don't explain, because they don't explain it. Either they don't know, or it wouldn't occur to them to explain it. Like we use the phrase the whole 9 yards without stopping to say the whole 9 yards, which, as you know, means X or Y, right? So it's all world building tucked in.
Well, I would just want to let you know that if nobody else does, I thoroughly enjoyed those, especially when you kind of go with them with the whole point of view. It's like, I don't get what that means. So
yeah. I was very proud of the "not my monkeys, not my circus, not my circus, not my monkeys." Yeah, I was very proud of that one.
Yeah, I had to laugh at that one. That's a phrase my daughter loves, so I'm like, I was just chuckling at that one.
Yeah.
Okay, what do we got going on here? I did want to ask you, I know you based this one on the Alexander the Great, and I felt like too the Keepers 6 was also based on a lot of Jewish lore. Am I correct on that? It seemed like it. I'm not being. How much research did you have to do in these, or a lot of these things stuff you were already interested in, and then you're like, I'm going to make a book about that?
So I've actually always been interested in the Alexander story from from, I don't know, probably late teens, for who knows why. I read a lot of Greek mythology when I was a kid, and then, later came across the Alexander story. And then I have to confess here that people watching this who've heard me say this before, or who know me already know, but I have 3 children, 2 of whom are twins, twin boys. And so my eldest, there's my eldest, who's a singleton, and then there's the twin boys. And the first of those boys is in fact named Alexander, because he was first through the breach when Alexander was famous for fighting at the front and being the first one over, right? He would lead from the front, right? So that's kind of our family in joke. So yeah, I have this long history of interest in Alexander the Great. And then the Court of Five book are actually based on a lot of research I did on Ptolemaic Egypt. And after Alexander died, which is not a spoiler because it happened over 2,000 years ago, his generals fought over his empire for 30 years. God, you got to feel sorry for all the poor people stuck in the middle of that rapacious war, right? God, I'm sure they were all horrible people. But Ptolemy, being very smart or cunning or something, so they carved out areas for themselves. And Ptolemy said, "Oh, I'll take Egypt." Now, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean at that time. It was also off to one side, which meant armies weren't marching back and forth through it. So off he goes to Egypt, and he founds, of course, the Ptolemaic dynasty, because they all named themselves after him. You know, all the kings were Ptolemies.
Well, you win. That's what you get to do.
Exactly. Well, but not everybody was as successful. So he was smart about what he did. Anyway, so now I'm down. I love history. I read so much history. I'm really a social sciences writer. But the other really fascinating thing about Ptolemaic Egypt, which is also related to living in Hawaii, which is this sense of colonization. So in comes this Macedonian / Greek top level of rulership on this huge indigenous population. In the same way, the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown in 1893, and this layer of colonization put on it. And I really got interested in that. And that's kind of the basis for the Court of Fives world, because the main character is her father is from the conquering. So this is like 100 years after the conquest happened. So her father is from the upper layer, the Macedonian Greek layer, and her mother is indigenous, right? So this quote unquote Egyptian layer. And so she lives kind of between these two worlds, and it's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot going on. But doing all this research on Ptolemaic Egypt got me even more interested in the successor wars. And I thought to myself, these successor wars would be perfect for space opera. And then I began to develop this story. And then I thought, well, I can't just say that the Alexander the Great analog, who I always knew I wanted to gender flip, because I wanted to have a woman in that Alexander role, which is someone who nobody thinks twice about them being a leader. There's no like, she's a good leader for a woman. No, it's just like, nobody said that about Alexander. He's a good leader for a young man or whatever. I mean, it was just assumed he could do what he did. And he just assumed so too. He didn't have to prove, he had to prove things, but not in that way, right? Mm-hmm. But I thought, I can't just say that this character was great. I have to at least show them in the beginning. And then, of course, once you bring on that character, they're like, this is my story, right?
I do want to apologize. Not sure what happened. We had a little bit of a hiccup. Popped up, the stream stopped, the recording stopped, said something about no internet, which was weird because I was doing that on the exact same computer that we were having the Zoom interview on, and Kate and I still could talk to each other. Didn't have any hiccup in the sounds. I could hear everything she said. However, something happened and we lost a little bit of it. The only thing you've missed is she's just wrapping up with the Alexander the Great part, the Furious Heavens novel we were talking about. And now we've moved on to some information about the Keeper 6 novel. And we'll drop you back into the episode. My apologies.
Solve what happened to him. And then I sat on it for years. And then everything else, and it's a contemporary fantasy, it's the only contemporary fantasy I've ever written that I can think of. And it's definitely the only one I've ever had published. And I wanted just to combine living in Hawaii as a person who lives there, and having a character who's Jewish, and it's not meant to be an analog of me. I don't write analogs of myself or other people. That doesn't interest me as a writer. So Esther is her own person, but I wanted to take these things that I knew and put them into a book together. So that's the genesis of that story. And then, though, I actually talked with my kids a bit about this one, and the dragon horde being like, that whole thing, like an Amazon warehouse. That was like one of my sons suggested that. And I'm like, yes, then there could be a Union Drive, and then there could be, right? And then yes. The whole thing kind of blew up. So it's a multiverse, but there's these other elements of it. So it was a real change of pace for me. And it's short, right? So,
yes, it was very enjoyable. Again, me on work days, so I'm only reading in the evening. Now, I'm not retired yet. I can't spend my whole day reading. 2 days, tops. If I'd had a whole day to read it, I would have been done. And part of it is the size, but again, too, like part of it on something like that is it's a book that when a chapter ends, you want to read the next chapter. You know, the one more chapter story. Just one more chapter, and then but also the fact that even though a lot of the terms and stuff were maybe not stuff that I was familiar with from the more Jewish stuff, the fact that everything made sense in context, didn't have to look anything up, didn't need a thesaurus or a dictionary nearby.
Yep.
And I have a relatively decent vocabulary, but I think sometimes some authors feel like I know a word, so I have to prove to everybody I can use this word in a sentence. There's somebody out there somewhere using anti-disestablishmentarianism. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
That the average person is probably going to have to look up. But I just blew through that book, loved it. I did have one question about one of the characters, Shahin. I hope I'm saying the right.
Yeah. Shaheen. I think it's Shaheen.
Okay. Yeah. Without, not going to spoil anything, that's obviously based on a specific character or a specific person.
Historical person.
Historical person. Don't look it up before you read the book. That's all I'm saying. Is that you knew you were going to write that type of character and then you like filled them in, or did you know that you wanted to write a character about him? If you remember.
That's tricky. That's tricky. I would, from the very, 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 very beginning with that first page, before I totally understood Esther's specific journey, I would say no. But the instant I knew that Esther was going to meet the so-called the boss's lieutenant, bam, that was it. And I knew it was going to be Shaheen. Yeah.
I was just curious because I love that character.
Yeah, I enjoyed doing that, and all the things that end up going along with that whole element of the plot, which we can't say.
It's too new, no spoilers, not quite yet.
Yeah. It's interesting though, writing a contemporary is really interesting when I've also been writing like a very dense secondary world. Like the Sun books are very dense. There's like, you don't want to explain too much, but if you don't explain enough, then people don't have context, right? And because these are worlds that the space opera world of Sun uses familiar things from Earth, but in these kind of broken ways, like you have a bunch of shards, right? There's a lot to process. But when you write contemporary fiction, people know, they get it, you get in your car and drive. I don't have to say any more than that. People immediately are that the most stuff I had to do with that book is like, I refer to going up onto the lanai, and my editor was, can't you just say porch? And I'm like, no, because it wouldn't be conceptualized as a porch. So I had to find a way to make it clear it was a porch, or what some people would call a porch, without doing that. So there was certain little Hawaiian things and certain elements of Jewish culture or lore that I had to tuck in the explanation. But beyond that, we know when someone, Mariana is a real estate agent, we know what that is. I never have to explain what that is. Right. So whereas in the Sun books, I might have to like add a little bit of detail when I say someone is a something. When I say someone is a writer, I have to describe what a writer, R-I-D-E-R, I have to describe what that is. Otherwise, people wouldn't know. And it's important. So that's kind of the benefit of contemporary fantasy. You have to explain less.
Yeah, the writers themselves, that's a very interesting whole thing going on there.
Yeah. Don't ask me where that comes from, because I don't know. It just comes up from the subconscious, and you're like, okay, I'm in. That's
one of those things where, okay, part of this would be kind of cool, and part of this would be really, really scary.
I think it would be very creepy.
Yeah.
And I think they are very creepy, but they're also human beings, so.
Okay, wow. I had a whole lot more questions, but we've already been on here for like an hour and a half. I don't know.
All right, then I don't know if I were, I think we're good.
Okay. Let me finish with I do have the last three that I usually do with everybody. Love to have you on again some other time because we missed so many questions. But one, what special skill or accomplishment outside of writing do you have that you wish more people knew about?
I thought a lot about this. I was going to say outrigger canoe paddling, but I talk about that all the time. So actually, I decided my special accomplishment is that despite being an imperfect parent, my adult children still like me and talk to me.
That's always a plus.
Yeah.
Mine sometimes pretend they know me, sometimes not so much. What question, although there's obviously some that we obviously didn't get to in here, what question were you expecting to be asked that maybe wasn't on this list that you thought would be on this list? And if you'd like to answer it, what would the answer be?
I'm always afraid I'm going to be asked some version of explain your whole career or catch us up. And I actually don't really love doing that. So I'm glad you didn't ask it.
Okay, that one's fine then. And then lastly, because we do this for everybody, is, you know, I'm not anti-Amazon, but shout out to your favorite brick and mortar bookstore.
So I would just say indie bookstores, indie bookstores, indie bookstores, and I'll name a couple. There's a new little one here on Oahu called The Shop, which is down in Kaimuki, if you know the area at all. I have done a number of events at Powell's, the big Powell's in Portland, Mysterious Galaxy in San Diego, Borderlands, University Bookstore in Seattle. Those are just, and I've done online events with other bookstores, other indie bookstores across the US over the last couple of years. And I just urge people, find your indie bookstores and support your indie bookstores. You're not going to get the big discount you would get at Amazon, but Amazon doesn't love books. And I buy books from Amazon sometimes because it's convenient, because I can get them for whatever reason. And so I get that. And I do buy ebooks on Kindle sometimes because, you know, for various reasons. But when I can, I use indie bookstores and support them.
Which I appreciate it. And I always remind people too that if you've ever been to an author book signing, I am 99.9% sure that Amazon didn't host it. It was a local independent bookstore somewhere.
That's right. And yeah, and even it's strange because even Barnes and Noble, which was kind of the big dog back in the day, right? Now they, in a way, are reframing themselves under new management as kind of more local indie bookstores. They're not really indies because they're a chain. But a friend of mine just said recently she had a great signing at a Barnes and Noble where they were really well prepared and they had a big audience. I did my first in-person signing in April with Fonda Lee at Powell's, and we had like 100 people. I was like boggled. It was like so many people. It was really exciting, and they were a great audience, and Fonda's spectacular. So read her Greenbone Saga and her new novella Untethered Sky. That was my little advertisement for, so
I do have to say Untethered Sky is on my TBR. I just haven't gotten to it yet. So
it's a perfect little novella. It really captures, it's a fantasy. It captures what the novella can do particularly well. The novella is a shape and a form that does some things really well, that it does some things better than other lengths do, better than short stories, better than novels, but it can seem like it's an extended short story or a truncated novel, right? But she like hits the sweet spot with it.
No, I'm starting to like those more and more often. Martha Wells, for instance, the Murderbot series. Obviously, those aren't novels, but they're the niche. I think those are the books you just love. It's like I can sit down in a weekend and knock this out.
Yep.
So totally get that.
Sometimes I want to read Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty, which is 4 books, each more massive than the last. And the density and the detail of that epic fantasy series is phenomenal to me. And sometimes I want to pick up Malka Holder's, what's it called? The Success of, it's a science fiction, Untethered Sky, which is one I've read recently. C.L. Polk's, even though I knew the end, is another. It's a noir set in the 1920s, and it's another novella. And then the Malka Older, which is the Success of something. Oh my God!
You put yourself on the spot.
Right? Yeah, but you can look it up. It's got this great yellow cover.
I'll look it up. I will tag it in YouTube.
It's a science fiction mystery set amid the moons of Jupiter after the ecological collapse of Earth. And again, it's just it was so nice. I read it. It was a full package and it was short. So I love the contrast.
Oh, me too. I love Robert McCammon's Swan Song, but that's over 1,000 pages. I'm not sitting that down for some evening going like, I'm going to knock this out. No, I'm not.
Yeah. I like that there's this range, is available to us.
It's what you're in the mood for. You know, I'm one of those weird people. I'm never up on anything because I read too many genres. Sci-fi fantasy still my favorite, but I get into everything, and yeah, I can't. That means you can't keep up with anything anymore.
No,
All right. So I want to just say that I appreciate you coming on. I didn't see any questions in the chat. I did see a couple of people in there, so some people at least were lurking. Hopefully, they're going to go pick up your book.
Thank you, people. Thank you. People.
Exactly. But appreciate you taking out your time, especially from such lovely weather as I'm sure you have in Oahu. I've been to Maui, I've been to Hawaii, I've not been to Oahu yet, though. So that one's still out there. But yeah, I just want to thank you for coming by. Definitely, guys, you got to read the book. Again, Keeper 6. If you're looking for a weekend read, that one's perfect. If you want something a little more meaty, this is book 2 of book 3. Furious 7 is book 2 out of a trilogy. So go back and read book 1. Don't mess yourselves up. But yeah, I am thoroughly enjoying it so far. Enjoy the humor, enjoy the emotions. I tune it to like one of those movies where it's really good because your emotions are all over the place. Oh, I'm laughing. Exactly. Oh, I'm crying. This isn't funny. Stop doing that to me.
Well, that's what you could, and that's the benefit of a big book like that, is that you can, not to compare myself to Shakespeare, but the thing about Shakespeare, one of the things about Shakespeare that works so well is that you get this whole range. You can do the comedic parts, you can do the light parts, you can do the romantic parts, you can do the tragic parts, you can do the action. There's room for all of it. And I love that.
And I think it makes each one of those stand out more for having just been the other direction.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
The laughs are funnier because you need that laugh. The tears are worse because you're like, I was just having a good moment. Why do you have to do that to me, man? All right. But yeah, we've been over here about 90 minutes, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. I could, not that you want to, but I could talk for another hour, but not everybody's going to want to listen to it. I have to
go clean my house.
Oh yeah, I'm sure my wife is waiting for me to do that part too. But again, appreciate it. Hope I get to talk to you again sometime. Definitely going to get book 3 when it gets out because you got me hooked now and I've got to see how it ends.
Thank you so much.
All right.
This was great because especially we had some different kinds of questions and different kind of discussion.
I like to mix it up. All right. Thanks everybody for stopping in. And like I said, YouTube, probably not tomorrow, maybe Monday. And everybody have a good one.